For 6 centuries, one empire waged war after war against kings, sultans, republics, crusaders, rebels, and the rising powers of Europe. It conquered nations, lost nations, redrew frontiers, endured crises, and kept armies marching from the Balkans to the Arabian desert. And through it all, it did something almost no other empire in history managed. It didn't go bankrupt doing it, because the Ottoman Empire didn't just fight wars, it figured out how to finance them indefinitely. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it seems. The Ottoman Empire lasted from roughly 1299 to 1922, longer than the Roman Empire, longer than the British Empire, and longer than almost any state familiar to the modern imagination. But longevity isn't the most interesting part. The real puzzle is how an empire that was almost perpetually at war managed to avoid financial collapse. Western audiences often assume empires fall because they lose battles. But battles don't bankrupt nations. Budgets do. Leaders do. Logistics do. The Ottomans grasped this early. And instead of building a conventional tax and army system like Europe's monarchies, they constructed something far more efficient, a political, economic engine in which war paid for itself. But before we dive into that machinery, we need to understand what the Ottomans actually were. For many in the West, the empire is a collage of images: turbans, sultans, domes, janissaries. Familiar, yet hazy. What's missing is the operating system underneath. So let's slow down, step inside, and set the stage. The Ottomans began as a small frontier principality in northwest Anatolia under Osman I, a warlord with a few thousand riders and impeccable timing. With the Byzantine Empire unraveling and Mongol influence retreating from the Near East, Osman's followers were perfectly placed to seize land and opportunity. Their early victories weren't just military, they were financial. Every conquest meant new land, new crops, new taxes, and new populations to draw revenue from, and that's the first key to the Ottoman financial model. From the very beginning, warfare wasn't a cost. It was an income stream. By the time they captured Bursa in 1326 and crossed into Europe in the 1350s, the Ottomans were no longer a border tribe. They were a rising power controlling the crossroads between Europe and Asia, medieval economics equivalent of owning the world's arteries. Every merchant moving from Venice to Persia, Cairo to Budapest, Baghdad to Istanbul passed through the Ottoman toll gate. This mattered because war demands three things: food, metal, and men. The Ottomans didn't necessarily have more of these than their rivals. What they did have was cash flow, steady, abundant, and diverse. Silk, spices, carpets, horses, weapons, timber, sugar, copper, everything moved through their lands, and everything was taxed. But strong revenue alone doesn't explain how they financed centuries of campaigns stretching from Vienna to Yemen. After all, plenty of empires had money, and still went broke. What made the Ottomans different was structural. They built a system that turned the army itself into a self-financing institution. Enter one of the most important, and most misunderstood, innovations in Ottoman history, the timar system. Imagine a government trying to avoid the single biggest military expense: payroll. Modern states pour fortunes into soldiers' salaries, equipment, horses, and pensions. Armies devour budgets. The Ottomans dodged this entirely. They didn't pay most soldiers in cash, they paid them in rights. A timar was essentially a tax district. A soldier, usually a cavalryman called a sipahi, received the right to collect taxes from a designated village or region. In return, he was obligated to maintain his horse, equip himself, and appear on campaign with proper armor and weaponry. No salary. No state-funded equipment, he financed himself. It was one of the most ingenious pieces of financial engineering in world history. The state cut its expenses dramatically, soldiers became invested in local stability, prosperous villages meant higher income, peasants lived under predictable local authority. And the empire maintained a large, mobile army without draining the treasury. Imagine paying soldiers today not with money, but with the right to collect taxes from a county. It sounds risky, because it is, but in the 1300s and 1400s, it worked brilliantly. It created a tax-powered military machine, and, more importantly, it made Ottoman warfare cheap. European rulers relied on expensive knights and mercenaries who demanded payment up front. When a king ran out of money, loyalty vanished. The Ottomans didn't face this problem. Their cavalry's funding flowed continuously, in war or peace. This system didn't just support an empire, it sustained one of the longest-lasting military states in human history. War didn't drain the Ottoman budget, it energized it. The timar system kept the cavalry self-financed, but that was only half of the empire's military machine. The other half came from an institution Western readers know by name but rarely understand, the Janissaries. Their creation, training, and funding model formed the second engine of Ottoman state power. To see how it worked, we have to shift focus, from cavalry maintained through land taxes to infantry built through a far more controversial system, the Janissary system, infantry without the upfront price tag. The Janissaries were the empire's elite, disciplined, loyal, professional soldiers trained from childhood. In European terms, they were the closest thing the medieval world had to Marines. What made them financially revolutionary was how the empire acquired them. They came from the devshirme, the so-called child levy. In Christian villages across the Balkans, boys were selected, removed from their families, converted to Islam, and educated in the empire's military schools. The system was harsh and coercive, no need to romanticize it. But economically, it achieved something no other empire managed. It shifted the early cost of raising children onto conquered populations. By the time these boys became soldiers, the state had skipped the enormous expense of supporting them through childhood. After entering service, they were paid and housed, but were barred from marriage and business ownership in their early centuries. That meant no divided loyalties, no hereditary estates, and no independent power bases. If the timar system made the cavalry self-sustaining, the Janissaries made the infantry exceptionally cheap and reliable. Together, they created a military machine that saved the empire immense sums over hundreds of years, making war pay for war, and the Ottomans weren't finished. They perfected something even more powerful. Every war funded the next one. Conquer new territory. You didn't just get land, you got new taxpayers, new timars, new ports, new trade routes, new revenue streams. European kingdoms often returned home from war poorer, the Ottomans often came home richer. That was the core of their longevity, not luck, not strategy. Cash flow, geography as an ATM. Their empire sat on history's greatest toll booth. The Bosporus, the Dardanelles, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea, caravan routes from Persia to Central Asia. If goods moved between continents, someone paid the Ottomans for the privilege. Silk, spices, carpets, metals, and manufactured goods all passed through their gates. By the 1500s, they were one of the wealthiest states alive. War was costly, yes, but trade was far more profitable. The empire's perpetual revenue machines. They built systems to capture this wealth, state monopolies, salt, tobacco, coffee, sometimes soap, vital goods, controlled directly by the state. Predictable revenue, year after year. These monopolies were the Ottoman ancestors of today's nationalized strategic industries. Think Saudi Aramco, Gazprom, the Suez Canal, tribute and vassal states. Regions from Crimea to Wallachia paid annual sums in exchange for autonomy or protection. Cheaper than direct rule. Another steady income stream. Because of these financial pillars, the empire avoided something that plagued European powers: debt. For centuries, the Ottomans lived within their means. No runaway borrowing. No giant bond markets dictating policy. The breaking point. But the world changed. Industrialized Europe developed new technologies. Trade routes shifted to the oceans. The caravan economy that had sustained the Ottomans began to wither. The timar system decayed, corruption spread, oversight crumbled, reliability vanished, and the Janissaries, over time they became wealthy, powerful, political, eventually a state within a state. Instead of enabling reform, they blocked it. Instead of serving the empire, they drained it. When the Ottomans finally tried to modernize their forces, they needed cash salaries, something their old systems had avoided for centuries. To get that cash, they turned to foreign loans. Those loans were expensive and dangerous. By the 1800s, the empire was borrowing heavily from European creditors. Debt ballooned. Payments fell behind. In 1881, an international commission led by France and Britain effectively took control of Ottoman finances. A humiliating end to a once self-sufficient empire. A pattern that keeps repeating. A familiar cycle emerges. A great power rises through fiscal discipline, maintains itself through innovative systems, ignores the early warning signs, and collapses when the numbers stop adding up. The modern parallels. Look around and the Ottoman system doesn't seem ancient at all. The timar system? Modern military outsourcing and defense contractors, trade tolls? The fight over global shipping lanes and energy choke points, state monopolies? National oil companies and sovereign wealth funds. Conquest pays for conquest? Resource-driven geopolitical competition, late borrowing and collapse? Modern sovereign debt crises. The mechanics of empire don't change. Only the uniforms do. The real lesson: empires don't die on the battlefield, they die on the balance sheet. The Ottomans survived 6 centuries because their financial system was disciplined, efficient, and built to turn war into profit. They fell when that system broke, when trade rerouted, when expansion stopped paying for itself, when the military grew expensive, and when foreign creditors owned their future. And that's the warning their story carries into the present. Financial systems can sustain power for centuries, until the moment they can't. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.